Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are looking at Unit 2.2, which is Energy and Matter Flow from Cells to Ecosystems. And we are beginning with Part 1, which is all about photosynthesis. All right, so you guys are ready? Hopefully. All right, let's get this show on the road, shall we? So first, a little intro to photosynthesis. Plants use the energy of sunlight to convert water and carbon dioxide into high energy sugars and oxygen. The equation for photosynthesis is opposite that of cellular reaction. Now, when we talk about using the energy of sunlight to convert water and oxygen, what we're saying is that the plant absorbs water through its leaves, through its roots, sends it up through the stem or trunk, and it gets sent to the cells of the leaves. On the underside of leaves are those little pores, those little openings called stomata, and they will take in carbon dioxide. Well, both of these, the carbon dioxide and the water, will be absorbed into the cell and sent to a particular organelle for use in photosynthesis. And the bonds in the carbon dioxide and water get broken down due to the energy of sunlight. So sunlight is like an energy catalyst here. So it brings energy to the system and activates the reaction. So we break the bonds, we rearrange them, and we end up getting C6H12O6, which is a particular carbohydrate monosaccharide called glucose. And then we also do create oxygen gas molecules, which would be given off as waste. So down here, we have the full balanced equation. 6 carbon dioxide, 6 CO2, plus 6 water molecules, 6 H2O, with light energy, because that light energy is the catalyst, will give us C6H12O6, so 1 molecule of glucose, plus 6 O2, 6 oxygen gas molecules. So what this is saying is, for every 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules that a plant takes in, they can make 1 glucose and 6 oxygen gas molecules out of it. Let's talk a little bit more about photosynthesis. So our photosynthesis occurs in a particular organelle, which is called the chloroplast. And within the chloroplast, there are these specific pigments that will absorb the sunlight, meaning that they're actually going to absorb energy from the sunlight. And these pigments are called chlorophyll. Now, there are different types of chloroplasts, and that's based on what kind of light each type of chloroplast can absorb. Now, what we mean by what type of light is, remember, you might have already learned that light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So it covers all the different kinds of EM waves, such as UV light, infrared, gamma radiation, radio waves. But right smack dab in the middle is the visible light spectrum, and that's what we're talking about here. Now, it's a visible light spectrum that goes all the way from red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, Roy G. Biv. And each one of those has a different wavelength. So different types of chloroplasts can actually absorb different wavelengths of light, making them more suited to maybe certain areas or certain types of environments. So things that are involved in photosynthesis besides carbon dioxide and water are ATP, also known as adenosine triphosphate, and ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So those are energy molecules. Then we have NADP+, which is the full name of that is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, and NADPH, which is just NADP plus with a hydrogen added to it. Now that is an electron carrier. And we're going to get to the role of these different molecules later once we actually talk about the different steps. But first, some pictures. So here's the chloroplast. It has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. You'll notice that there are these stacks. The stacks are called granums, but the stacks are made up of these flat discs, which are called thylakoids, and those are also where the chlorophyll is located. These connections between the granums, those are lamellas, and the fluid, the jelly-like fluid that fills up the space, that's called the stroma. And the little space between the outer and inner membrane, that's called the intermembrane space. So this is just kind of giving a quick summary of what we're talking about and where things occur. So the light hits the thylakoids, and that's where we're going to do the first part of the reaction, which also involves water. The second part of photosynthesis actually occurs out in that jelly-like substance, the stroma, and that's where we do the second step. This is where we also take in the carbon dioxide, use it here, and we end up getting our sugars. Now, there are certain factors that will affect how quickly photosynthesis can occur. So in other words, the rate of photosynthesis. One is the abundance of water. Remember, we said water was a reactant, so the plant needs water if it is going to run photosynthesis. If there's not as much water present, then that means that they can't do as much photosynthesis, and that's going to slow down the rate of photosynthesis. Imagine if I asked you guys to build a Lego set, but I took away half the Legos. Could you build the full set? No. You might be able to kind of, finagle it and make a smaller version of whatever the set's of with just half of the Legos, but it's going to take you a little more time because you got to try and work more judiciously. The intensity of light. So what that means is how much light is there actually being reached to the leaves where photosynthesis occurs. So if there's a lot of light or a stronger intensity of light, then the plant can keep doing photosynthesis over and over. But if there is a lower intensity of light, let's say at like dusk or dawn, then there's going to be less photosynthesis occurring, because remember we said that photosynthesis needs light to activate the reaction. So if there is less intense light, then that means there's going to be less photosynthesis. And the final factor is temperature. Now, temperature or heat is it's an energy source. It's a form of energy. And as molecules get exposed to more heat, as they heat up and they absorb the heat into them, molecules tend to move faster. It's kind of like you played any of the Mario games. When Mario gets a star, what happens? Well, he starts, kind of blinking, the music changes, and he moves a lot faster. That's kind of what it's like with heat. The molecule absorbs the heat like Mario absorbs the star. And once the molecule absorbs the heat, it's going to move faster. Now, if the molecules are moving faster, then there's more likely chance of a reaction occurring. So that means that the water can get to the chloroplast faster, the carbon dioxide can get to the chloroplast faster. Since everything is moving faster, we can go through photosynthesis faster, which means we can do more photosynthesis in a shorter amount of time. But it's the opposite when you take the heat away, when the temperature cools down. That's an absence of heat. And since heat is a form of energy, that means it's an absence of energy. So when the molecules cool down, instead of going at their normal pace, then they're moving in slow motion. And since they're moving in slow motion, it takes them longer to get where they need to go, which means it takes them longer to run the reaction. All right, there are 2 steps in photosynthesis. The first part is called the light-dependent reaction, and you guessed it, this is where the light comes in. The second part is the Kelvin cycle, also sometimes called the light-independent reaction. As you can see in the picture, the light reaction occurs in the thylakoid discs of the granum, because that's where the chlorophyll is, so it's going to absorb the light to activate the reaction. And the second part, the Kelvin cycle, occurs in the stroma. Now let's take a little look at each one of these. Now we're going to give you a lot of detail here. Depending on which class you're in, you may or may not need to know this much detail, but I wanted you to have a foundational knowledge of this. So energy is absorbed from the sunlight. Chlorophyll absorbs the energy. Remember, the chlorophyll is in the thylakoids, and it absorbs the energy and it transfers that energy from the light to electrons. The electrons are going to start moving through what's called the electron transport chain. This is a series of proteins that are going to move the electrons from one to the other. The water molecules are going to be present at this point, and they're going to split. We're going to break them up. The electrons from the water molecules replace those that left the chlorophyll. So the electrons in the chlorophyll that got energized by the sunlight and left to go through the ETC, the electron transport chain, we need to replace those. So when we break the water molecule, we release some electrons and we put those electrons back in the chlorophyll. This also creates hydrogen ions. Now, hydrogen ions are also going to be transported across the thylakoid membrane. So the electrons, as they move from one protein to the next in the electron transport chain, that energy of their motion, of their movement, is actually going to draw more hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane and into the thylakoid. Energy is absorbed from sunlight, so the chlorophyll absorbs more energy from the sun, and the electrons, once again, leave the pigment, leave the chlorophyll molecule. More water comes in, break it apart, replace the electrons that just left. NADPH is produced. So electrons at the end of the electron transport chain, the electrons that make it to the end are then added to NADP+. And this is going to allow to attract a hydrogen molecule to form NADPH. Now, NADPH is an electron carrier. I like to call them electron taxis because they're just going to simply collect the electrons and move them to the next step. Hydrogen ion diffusion. So the hydrogen ions, remember, we brought them across the membrane, and we did that to build up a concentration of them. Now that means that there are more hydrogen ions inside the membrane than on the outside of the thylakoid membrane. So what we're going to do is the hydrogen ions are going to move down their concentration gradient and move out of the thylakoid membrane, or well, move out of the thylakoid disc through a particular protein called ATP synthase. Now what happens is as the hydrogen ions flow through the channel in the ATP synthase, it's going to generate energy like a water wheel does. And that energy is going to be stored on ADP, adenosine diphosphate. When you store energy there, it allows you to form a bond with a third phosphate, turning it into ATP. All right, so here's a picture. Light hits the chlorophylls. The electrons start moving through the electron chain. That means that we used up electrons here. We take the water molecules, we break them, it releases electrons, and we put those electrons back here to replace the ones that are gone. This allows us to form hydrogen ions. Now the oxygen gas molecules that are left over are going to be sent out of the cell as a waste product. So we are already starting to accumulate hydrogen ions. As the electrons are being passed from one protein to the next, they use energy, and that causes these hydrogen ions on the outside of the thylakoid in the stroma to be pulled across the membrane and into the thylakoid itself. More energy via light is passed on to the electrons, and they will end up on this last enzyme. This is where they get picked up by NADP+. So the electrons, when added to NADP+, will change its ionization, which will then allow it to form a bond with this hydrogen ion, forming NADPH. This is then going to go over and be used in the second step, the Kelvin cycle. Now, since we're pulling all of these hydrogens across the membrane, plus, we're also making some via the breaking of water, we're going to build up a large concentration of hydrogen ions on this side and a smaller concentration of hydrogen ions on this side. Now, when that occurs, we know from a previous chapter that molecules want to flow from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. I'm going to move my camera for a moment. And that's where this protein comes in. This is called ATP synthase. It has a channel through it, and it's going to allow the hydrogen ions to move from the inside of the thylakoid, where the concentration of hydrogen ions is greater, through to the outside, where the concentration of hydrogen ions is less. Now, as it gets pulled through this, it generates energy. And that energy is going to be used to form ATP. Now, the way it does that is, so adenosine triphosphate is adenosine with 3 phosphates hanging on it. Now, they're actually hanging in a chain, but my fingers aren't exactly detachable. Now, how this works is you have to start with adenosine diphosphate and a separate phosphate. When the energy is created by the hydrogen ions moving through ATP synthase, it's going to generate energy, and we're going to take that energy and store it in as a bond to form a bond between that lonely phosphate and adenosine diphosphate in order to make adenosine triphosphate. Now, the ATP and the NADPH that we created from this, those are all going to move to the next set, or the next stage of photosynthesis, the Kelvin cycle. Move this back. All right, so let's talk about the Kelvin cycle. So this is where the carbon dioxide comes in. It is added to a 5-carbon molecule that is already present within the cycle. So it's left over and has been recycled from the last photosynthesis. So this 5-carbon molecule is already there. Carbon dioxide attaches to it in order to form a 6-carbon molecule. Now we're going to use that and we're going to split it to form 2 3-carbon molecules. Now remember how we said that we took ATP and the electron carrier NADPH from the light reaction and brought them here? This is where they're used. The ATP is going to provide the energy to split the molecule and rearrange the bonds. The NADPH is going to provide electrons to help with that. 3-carbon molecules, the 2 3-carbon molecules are going to exit. One of them is going to leave the cycle, but it's going to wait. The other one's going to stay in the cycle. Now, as this goes on again with another carbon dioxide, we're going to grab another one of those 3 carbon molecules from a second round of this cycle. I'm going to take those 2 3 carbon molecules that have left the cycle at different points, and we're going to combine them and rearrange them in order to form a 6 carbon sugar, i.e. glucose. But the one that stayed in the reaction is going to get recycled. As this keeps going and going, we're going to make a collection of 3 carbon molecules. Specifically, we're going to collect 5 of them, and then we're going to rearrange that into 3 5 carbon molecules, and those 5 carbon molecules are going to be reused back in the first part of the Kelvin cycle. All right, so here we have carbon dioxide entering. Now the carbon dioxide is going to form a 6 carbon molecule because it's going to attach to this 5 carbon molecule over here that's already present. So we have our 5 carbon molecule combines with the carbon dioxide and it forms a 6 carbon molecule. The 6 carbon molecule is going to use energy from the ATP as well as the electrons from NADPH in order to break the bonds and rearrange them to form 2 3 carbon molecules. One of those 3 carbon molecules is going to stop and leave the reaction. We're going to just hold on to it right here for a little bit. The other one is going to continue on in the reaction. Now, the one that continues on is going to use some more ATP to rearrange its bonds. Now, the reason why we do that is, remember, this is a cycle. It keeps going over and over and over again. And eventually, we're going to collect 5 of those 3 carbon molecules here. When we collect 5 of them, we're going to use this ATP energy to rearrange them into 3 5 carbon molecules. And the 5 carbon molecules can go back and start working again. Now remember, we left one of the 3 carbon molecules down here. As another carbon dioxide goes through this cycle and reaches this point where it breaks into 2 3 carbon molecules, one of those is also going to stay down here. So now we have 2 3 carbon molecules there. They can combine and reform into glucose. And that is how the plant makes glucose. So here's just an overall picture. This is just a good summary picture. Again, here's the equation: 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water molecules with energy from the sun allows us to create 1 glucose molecule plus 6 oxygen gas molecules. And a good summarization, we have step 1 here, which is the light dependent reaction. Water goes in, light goes in, oxygen comes out as a waste. We charge up ATP and NADPH, they move over to the Kelvin cycle. Carbon dioxide goes in, glucose comes out. Since we've used up the energy and electrons from ATP and NADPH, they're back to being ADP and a phosphate, and NADP plus, they go back to the light reaction in order to recharge. Now, what about organisms that are producers but don't have access to the sun? Yeah, that happens. How do they get their glucose? Well, there is another similar process called chemosynthesis. So what this is, instead of using light energy, it's a process of using chemical energy to make sugars like glucose from carbon dioxide in order to create the glucose for energy storage. Now, as we said, this is done in areas where sunlight may not be common or available at all, but other chemicals are very abundant, such as hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. Like photosynthesis, chemosynthetic organisms do make their own food, so they do make their own glucose. The raw materials do differ, obviously, because there's no sunlight. We need different chemicals in order to run these reactions. So one of the possible compounds could be hydrogen sulfide, H2S. And here's an example of an equation that can be used for chemosynthesis. We have 6 CO2 plus 24 H2S. So 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 24 hydrogen sulfide molecules will yield 1 molecule of glucose, C6H12O6, plus 24S plus 18H2O. So it will yield 1 glucose plus 24 sulfur atoms plus 18 water molecules. Here's a picture of that. So here we have our hydrothermal vent, and here we are showing some muscles that are creating their own glucose. Hydrogen sulfide actually comes out through the vent. Carbon dioxide is dissolved in the water. You take in the water, gives them the carbon dioxide, also brings in the hydrogen sulfide. They're able to make their glucose. All right. And now some additional resources. We do have a Science in Pajamas video on photosynthesis where I kind of diagram and explain everything. Then we also have other videos which include the Amoeba Sisters, photosynthesis, and the teeny tiny pigment pancakes. We have Bozeman Science, photosynthesis. We have Get Science and Technology, differences and similarities between chemosynthesis and photosynthesis. And last but not least, we have EV Nautilus on chemosynthesis. All right, so I hope this helps you guys out to understand a little bit more about what's going on here. If you have questions, catch me in Google Classroom or email or in class. But in the meantime, you guys, just stay awesome, stay curious, and definitely stay safe and healthy. All right, you guys, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.